And now, the Lowdown, with economist and political strategist Elson Low. And now, the Lowdown, with economist and political strategist Elson Low.
I would like to invite the first speaker, Mr. Elson Low, to give his opening remarks.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Now that we can get rolling. So I don't know how often you've heard the expression, Guyana is not a real place, right? You hear that quite a lot. But I thought to myself, what does this really mean for Guyana? What does this actually mean in terms of our development? And how can we, is there any way for us to quantify Guyana not being a real place? I believe that I just get a little bit of trouble with the projector here, but no problem. So how do we quantify that? Now, that question, if we can answer it, I think is a core development question, and a type of question that will help us understand how we can proceed with our considerable oil and gas resources such that we can actually accomplish development of whatever form. So today, on the one hand, I'll share some light notes, but I'll give you some mathematical models and some, based off of various economic papers and based off of my own experience that would help us, I think, to chart a course going forward. That's one of the things we wanna start off with. Now, just by way of my background, you will have heard that I worked at Goldman Sachs and Co. for a little bit. Now, the thing about Goldman Sachs is that really you're required to do a couple of things. The first is everyone at the firm is required to kind of have a flexible understanding of mathematics and economics, but also you interact with and you have responsibility for a lot of money. I would just ask you, have you ever held $1 million in your hand? Have you ever held $100 million in your hand? Have you ever had access to $1 billion US? Now, when you have responsibility like that, it can be quite frightening, right? Because the slightest mistake could result in a large loss. But what happens is that you have to kind of develop a culture and a way of approaching dealing with resources that enables you to be in a position to minimize loss, to maximize the gains from resources, and to be able to properly manage what you're placed with. And so that, I think from a cultural perspective, is something that we should note. And over the course of my remarks, you'll kind of see why this is pretty critical for Guyana going forward. Now, one of the things that I also wanted to ask, just bring up as we roll into things is, why is the UG free, folks? It's been a couple of years. We had $782 billion in the budget. Couldn't find a little $5 billion to make UG free. I was campaigning to make UG free several years ago, right on those lawns over there. And it is unfortunate that we've not seen the university be made free. But that is, I think, one of the critical questions that we must look at as we consider, this idea of Guyana not being a real place. But now that we consider the moot, now let us consider the moot. Let me ask you an interesting question as we engage with this moot. Do you believe that this government, or any government, would admit that they intend to accomplish development, however defined, by way of incompetence? If not, competent governance must be a core element of any quote-unquote right path to development. You can accomplish some form of development by way of incompetence, but I submit that that cannot reasonably be the right path to development. Now, from that perspective, let me jump across to my first slide here. Slides moving out. Now, folks, you recall this bird, the jumbie bird, the so-called jumbie bird. Now, I want to engage with this in a different way than we've engaged. We make laugh of it and so on. But I want to ask you an interesting question. Do you believe that the government had seen this bird before it was put in place, before they set it up? Or do you kind of suspect that they hadn't seen it and that it was not enough time was left for them to change the bird? There's kind of that question, right? Whether or not they actually checked. And you'll note that that is going to be a persistent development question for Guyana, in as much as you would imagine that it would be something that is not an issue, but a persistent question. Now, there are three core areas of government incompetence that I'll try to highlight as we engage with this moot. The first being that the government puts Guyana at risk in ways that it does not need to. The second being that the government has failed to reform its approach. And the third being that there's poor planning and understanding of Guyana's development problems. Now, and I know many of you, or some of you I suppose, are here because of late, a certain vice president has been calling my name. But you know, the first time that he actually called my name, it's kind of interesting because he misquoted me, I think, 3 times, one after the other. And I thought to myself, you know, that's kind of a strange mistake to make, easily avoidable. Did you not check my remarks or read over my remarks well? Now, that may seem like a light thing to you, but actually, what we've observed, and we were speaking about the audit of Guyana's offshore oil expenses at the time, was that there was a lingering question as to whether the government was taking a casual approach regarding the audit of Guyana's offshore oil expenses. Now, you may not want to take my word for it, that's fine, but here's what Stabroek News had published. Ram slams failure to audit US $9 billion, it's since been revised to $7 billion, of Exxon's expenses. With government still to adequately explain why it allowed auditing of ExxonMobil's expenses to fall into default, Chartered Accountant Christopher Ram flayed its nonchalant attitude. Now, in a way, an audit is checking the bills, right? You're checking to see whether we've been charged the right amounts, whether the costs have been inflated. Now, at the time, one of the things that it really had offended me that we're going to adopt, as the newspapers are saying, as Ram is saying, as some have contended, what might be a casual attitude to the audit because of the amount of money that is involved. And so I said it should be a criminal offense. It should be a criminal offense not to audit on time, and it should be a criminal offense to hide the results of an audit. Some of you may have noticed that the audit which the coalition government had commissioned, the first audit, was leaked to the media earlier this year, and that we saw that in excess of 12%, which is in excess of 200 million US, that those funds were funds that could potentially be recovered once that audit had been completed. And so when you talk about not checking, we kind of come from a place where, it's a joke, we have a laugh of it. But when not checking could result in a 200 million US loss, that's a serious thing. And when not checking, when larger amounts are considered, could result in as much as $1 billion US of losses. That too is an extremely, extremely serious thing. Now, the kind opponent, sometimes will write on some of these issues, will quote me. And after, that first interaction with Jack Dew, I observed that he had actually quoted me in a couple of articles. I responded to them in the press. But what I observed is that he had misquoted me on more than one occasion and had written entire articles misquoting me. And I thought to myself, well, you did all of that work. You'd think that you'd want to check the moot. Now, of course, it could be that this is all an accident. I completely understand that. I mean, it could be that the accidents happen quite frequently. I completely understand that. But again, we want to explore this idea a little bit. So, jumping to the next slide. This is actually an article that the DPI had put out, where this kind data is quoted, and where he says that the education budget from 2019 to 2021, for the coalition budget versus the government budget, had increased by 1,000%. Now, folks, it had increased by 16%. You can check the media, you can do the calculations for yourself. I'm not particularly interested in that. What I'm interested in is, it's kind of strange that it didn't occur to him this number might be wrong, right? And it kind of makes me feel like maybe he didn't check. Now again, it could be maybe he lives by a fire station, there's a lot of alarms and so on, and so it's distracting. That's very possible. But this is something that I thought might be interesting. In that regard, I would just point out to you that I'm sure that Mr. Bagudin will cite quite a lot of numbers. But, you know, unfortunately, due to the interaction that we've had over the last year or so, I think Jesus Christ would have to come and tell me that these numbers and that these citations are correct. Because I can't imagine that you're going to see 1,000% increase, you're going to cite 1,000% increase, and not occur to you that maybe this is off. Anyway, we walk on. Now, you may recall that regarding the parent company guarantee controversy that we've seen in Guyana recently, regarding the question of unlimited, the question of having adequate liability for an oil spill offshore Guyana, there's been a lot of contention as to whether or not a parent company guarantee that is unlimited is warranted and whether that's the right approach that should be taken. But I'll tell you what I find to be interesting about this entire discussion, and really central to our question of national development. Here's a quote from the judge in that particular, Judge Kisun, in that particular ruling. Of course, he ruled that the EPA was in violation of its mandate, or that it wasn't carrying out its mandate. The judge ruled that, and I quote, "The agency failed to take any meaningful step or any step whatsoever to assess what was provided to it by ESSO, the permit holder, purportedly as environmental liability insurance." Now, this is a $600 million US insurance policy. And you didn't check? Now, of course, you know, this policy says Egypt and not Guyana. But folks, I said to myself, that's too ridiculous. Let me ask 3 different lawyers what they think. Why? Because of the importance of checking. So I asked a lawyer I know that sometimes makes remarks friendly to the PUP. I asked a lawyer that I know to be in civil society more neutral. I asked a lawyer that is related to the PNC. And all of them indicated to me that they were uncomfortable with the wording. Now, it could be that the wording is fine. Now, it could be that, and I'm sure there'll be arguments back and forth regarding the parent company guarantee. You know, there'll be lots of arguments. But is anyone really going to argue that the EPA shouldn't be checking to see what it has received, to see whether this is in actual fact what it's supposed to be? That could potentially, according to some estimates provided by ExxonMobil, impact an oil spill. It could impact as many as 12 Caribbean islands. How can you possibly be looking at a government that is going to endanger, potentially endanger 12 different islands because they haven't even checked the insurance? Folks, we march on. And like, as I indicated, I'll give you a precise mathematical understanding of what's going on here and help you to see the country in a different perspective. Now, we've observed that the gas to energy project is going to be making use of a couple of firms, CH4 and Lindseka. One of these firms, however, is a firm that has a Venezuelan background. Of course, we know that we've long had difficulties with Venezuela. I spoke to one of the, when I was at the U.S. Embassy for a reception, I spoke to one of the gentlemen from CH4, and he expressed that he has full confidence in Lindseka, and I'm sure they're a very professional company. But when I hear that a critical piece of national infrastructure is going to be constructed by a Venezuelan company, I am concerned. I want you to imagine that the US Hoover Dam, that huge dam that powers an entire section of the US, one of the tallest dams in the world, was constructed by a Russian company. Would that ever happen? And don't you kind of suspect that the government was just as surprised as the rest of Guyana that it was a Venezuelan company? Did they check? Because it seems to me that is very unusual. Now anyway, we continue on, there's also a question now of a feasibility study for the excess gas that we see produced offshore. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I think it was in May 13th, there was an article in Cairo in which the ExxonMobil had indicated that there was no excess gas. Now, they came out a few days later to say that there is indeed excess gas, but the PSA says that you're supposed to conduct a feasibility study to ascertain the amount of gas. Now, folks, from the time in which they said there was no excess gas to the time in which they clarified that there was gas, people were calling the leader of the opposition's office, people were calling me, civil society people in a panic, because we were about to invest $2 billion US in a gas plant, in a gas pipeline, and there's no gas? Now, folks, why was there this panic? If there was a feasibility study, as the PSA has indicated there should be, do you think that there would be panic and confusion? But sad to say, we have to kind of keep going on this route. You'll recall actually that the vice president would have said, and I have a quote here, I have as well a citation here as to when he said it, that the gas to energy project was a no-brainer. I want you to hold that at the back of your mind as we continue this conversation. Now, one of the other things that came up, another way that the government really endangered the Guyanese people here is regards the funding of the gas pipeline via cost oil. Now, the Cato Institute, which is an institute that investigates corruption, they have an article here about corruption, mismanagement, and abuse of power in Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. And what they indicate here is that along with the increase in revenues has come a simultaneous reduction in transparency. For example, the state-owned company ceased publishing its consolidated annual financial statements in 2003. You'll recall that we just had a conversation about the audits being held, not being published, and an audit actually had to be leaked. Now, what is also indicated is that Chavez has created state-run financial institutions whose operations are also opaque and that spend funds at the discretion of the executive. And so this is one of the ways that he was able to bypass Venezuela's parliament, bypass Venezuela's constitution and its protections. Now, funding national infrastructure directly from cost oil, that also will similarly bypass Guyana's institutions. It is extremely dangerous, and frankly, it's needless. Now, of course, my esteemed opponent here has written extensively on this. But after going back and forth, I observed that a few weeks later that ExxonMobil had said that they were no longer going to be facilitating paying for the pipeline via cost oil, but rather that they would be focusing on selling natural gas, which would pass through the natural procurement system. Now, one of the things that concerns me is that my esteemed colleague here is a public procurement commissioner. And so of all the Guyanese I thought would be riling up about what could potentially be a bypassing of the entire constitution and public procurement process, I thought he'd be at the forefront. Folks, it's not $5 we're talking about. We're talking about $1 billion US for a pipeline, potentially bypassing the entire procurement process. Just like in Venezuela, they were able to bypass the process. And there's one pipeline, you might have several. Now, folks, where does this lead us? Let's close off this question of the pipeline with a bit of a sense of some of the math. Now, we've seen, and it's been widely reported that originally Exxon had indicated the pipeline would cost as much as $478 million, $500 billion, but that estimate had been increased to $1.3 billion, then it came back to $1 billion. Now, admittedly, this is a complex transaction. There's a lot of different elements. The pipeline is longer as it has been moved and so on. There's a lot of conversation to have around that. But if I told you that we're going to the supermarket and we're going to buy some milk. And this milk moved from costing $500 to costing $1,300. Don't you think you might consider some juice? Now, what we've been saying in Coalition is that we need an updated feasibility study. That is to say that we have to check to see what is going on, because we weren't talking about these types of costs before. Now, the IMF. The IMF has been paying close attention to what's been going on in Guyana. They often publish their consultation reports. One of the things that they have indicated, and they started a public investment management assessment in 2015, is that closing efficiency gaps means big gains for public investment. On average, about 30% of the potential value of public investment is lost to inefficiencies in the investment process. And closing this efficiency gap could substantially increase the economic dividends from public investment. Now, they did an assessment of Guyana a couple of years after they started doing these assessments in 2017. And what they found was that 59 cents of every dollar is wasted. And that for Guyana's peers, it's 70 cents out of every dollar. And for emerging markets, it is 41 cents of every dollar is wasted. For Guyana's peers, 30 cents of every dollar. And for the emerging markets, it's 27 cents. Now, when I heard this number, my first thought was that we should pack up the government and give back the taxpayers the money because it's a waste of time. But when the IMF came, I sat and I asked them, this number is unbelievable. Are you talking about just the coalition here? Are you talking about Guyana generally? What is going on? And what they indicated to me is that it is longer-term recommendations and that this is something that we should implement with a longer-term view. It is not just over a course of 1 year or so. When you look at their statements following this, staff cautioned that scaling up public investment without addressing the shortcomings identified will undermine its effectiveness. In fact, and this is a quote from a newspaper, so you can take it with a grain of salt, Kaicher actually quoted them as saying, the fund said, there should be a thorough assessment of how fast investment could be scaled up without hitting supply bottlenecks and generating inefficiencies. If the public investment management process is weak, the investment will not be translated into better infrastructure and will not support the diversification of the economy and sustainable economic growth. Now, they've gone further. In 2017, they keep talking about this. You saw the coalition take some efforts in 2019. Those efforts need to be continued. But in 2022, they again spoke about this. And they said, staff urged the authorities to implement the recommendations of that original report and to undertake a public expenditure review to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of public spending. So that 2017 report highlighted weaknesses in the planning, budgeting, appraisal, selection, procurement, and implementation of capital projects. Now, what's the upshot of this? The upshot of this is that the IMF is trying to say that we need to reform the way that we govern Guyana, that it cannot continue to not be a real place, and that we're suffering very significant losses. Now, I'm sure that my learned colleague will make lots of references to activities that the government has done and so on. But here's the thing. If these numbers are to be believed, and of course you could say that you don't believe the IMF, that's up to you, but let's say that there's something to consider. Now, that means that over a 5-year period, if we assume that the budget will expand at the rate of 15%, you're going to basically save over $330 billion. And what that means is that you could lift 153,000 people out of poverty while simultaneously accomplishing every single thing that the government says it's doing in infrastructure and education. And so the idea is that really what's going on in Guyana is that because of bad governance, 153,000 people are living in poverty when they didn't need to be living in poverty. It is the sacred responsibility of the government to help those in need. Sacred responsibility. And we cannot be running a country in such a way that because we don't check, because we don't implement these types of recommendations, we are actually in a position where people are poor for no reason. And so no matter what my opponent says, no matter how he defines development, at the back of your mind you have to understand that that can't be the right path to development, because the side effects of not reforming are that hundreds of thousands of people remain in poverty. That can't be the government that we're going to look at. Folks, I could go on and on. I'll just close with something that I just want to point out to to the audience more generally. One of the things that really disturbs me is what we look at when it comes to education in Guyana. And I keep track of the pass rate in mathematics at CSEC. I don't know if that's an indication, my time is nearly done. But, you know, we spent in the 2013 budget $26 billion for a 36% pass rate in mathematics. We spent $60 billion in 2022 for a pass rate of 34% in mathematics. Even if you account for inflation, that's nearly twice as much that we spent. Even if you account for COVID, oh my goodness, we spent something like $23 billion more, and we had a worse pass rate. We're not going in the right direction if we're spending money and looking at output, but not actually outcomes, improving people's lives. And so, folks, that to me is totally, totally unacceptable. As I close off, one of the things I just want to remind you guys of, and it looks like the projector's gone. Moderator, I don't know if I'm going to get a minute or two of time as this projector keeps falling asleep on me. Well, I don't know if our esteemed timer has been keeping track of. Yes, folks, I want to go back to this number here. I want to impress upon you that no matter how many facts or figures you hear, the critical point for our governance, and here maybe it's due to repeated accidents, is that we cannot continue to live in a country where you're going to see 1,000% listed, a graph provided, and not ask yourself, well, maybe this is kind of off. The reason that I was able to figure out all of this is because I asked, this number looks strange, let me find out more. That, to me, is the right path for development for Guyana. And anything short of that doesn't do the people of Guyana justice and puts us, I think, in a position that is just the wrong path to development. We must reflect, we must take seriously that just by running the country more effectively, not only could we accomplish everything that my opponent might want to say is a government accomplishment, but we could raise people out of poverty. Now that is the bare minimum. I mentioned, my last point, I know I'm saying a lot of last, I mentioned that the university again is not free. One of the ways to fix this is what the coalition has said. Hire people from the University of Guyana, do feasibility studies, make it free, fund it. That is how you can get a better performance. And in fact, of course, you can implement those IMF recommendations via this employment, but in fact, you can perform even better. How is it that we're going to continue to underperform even our Caribbean peers? Rather, we should be thinking to ourselves, can't we do better than that? And if we do better than that, we could easily double these numbers and pull 300,000 people out of poverty. UNICEF has said as of 2021 at the end of it that there was 43% poverty rate in Guyana. We cannot be taking, to my mind, an approach that doesn't matter if, 300,000 people or 150,000 people are living in poverty. It's a no-brainer, We don't need to check. We don't need to conduct studies. We don't need to listen to the IMF. We don't need to perform reform. We don't need to engage in reform. Rather, we can just continue on doing the same old. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, I can speak at length for another, quite a bit. Mr. Timer, can you give me an estimate? I imagine I only have like a third of seconds left, but I have 3 more minutes. That's perfect. All right. Now, as we have a little bit of time, I want to give you something to reflect on. And it's an argument I've been making probably for 5 years now. It's the first argument I made when I came back from Goldman Sachs. Is that what we have to do is to model out the entire oil and gas industry over the course of a 30-year, or you can push it out for a 50-year period. And we have to prepare not just for the oil that we have, but for the oil that we might find. That we need to structure our thinking in that way, and as a result, we'll be able to anticipate and to govern more effectively. Now, basically, this is the equation we're looking at. Wealth and work. Imagine for a moment you're Jeff Bezos' son. You might work, but you don't need to work, right? You can live off the interest from your investments. Imagine for a moment you're working at minimum wage. You might work multiple jobs. Now, this basically is a decision curve that indicates how you should approach it. What you're looking at with that arrow is additional oil finds, and of course you've got a situation where to the left you've got less wealth, more work, and to the right you've got more wealth, less work. So essentially what this means is that we should be keeping track of what our sovereign wealth fund will look like, what our NRF will look like, and how we can use that to fund the national budget without even having to charge taxes. Now, we are somewhere along this path. But really, the mathematically inclined of you may realize that this is really just, right, you can draw up a mathematical equation. But this is an equation that you can use to look at probably 100 variables, and you can solve those variables via the substitution method for simultaneous equations. And so you can actually plot out Guyana's future and plot out multiple scenarios. So when I say check, I mean not just what exists or what might exist, or not just what exists, but what might exist, so that we can respond immediately. The way to plan, the way to structure Guyana's budget is through these types of long-term plans. And that's the type of thinking that you see in the coalition. That's why we can say, oh, in 3-4 years, we'll be able to eliminate poverty. In 3-4 years, maths pass rates will rise by 15%, that kind of thing. It is that kind of structured approach that is required. Is that kind of structured approach in partnership with the University of Guyana that will move the country forward, rather continuing with the same approach where if anything happens is not appropriate. And of course, you may have different variables that you want to plug in, but we cannot shy away from seriously considering what the implications are of the fact that Guyana, as an example, has the second most barrels of oil per person in the entire world. From the fact that we have 43% poverty, but we're living in a country that has a higher GDP, purchasing power parity than the United Kingdom. On that note, folks, thank you very much, and I'll yield my time.
We have listened to our debaters make their presentations, and at this time, we are opening the floor for the floor debate from the audience. Our moderator will be conducting this bit of the debate as well. So I trust you have some interesting questions here this afternoon. Mr. Moderator, over to you.
Thank you very much. So we would now open the floor for questions. And the aim is to utilize 20 minutes for this section. We're trying to have at least 2 questions from the secondary schools, 2 questions from the university students, 2 questions from the media, and we'll try to slip in 2 questions for persons who are not part of those 3 brackets. Could we start? We have someone in front here.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Reginald Brown. I attend the St. Stanislaus College. So my question is geared towards the proposing. Now, my question is, with the potential windfall from oil revenues, how would you propose an alternative path to development that can offer a comparable economic growth and job creation opportunities for Guyana? Now, what sectors or industries do you believe that can contribute to an inclusive economic development?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question. The second part of it, can you just repeat that? You said what steps? Or I didn't quite catch you.
Sectors.
I said what sectors? Yeah.
Alternative path. All right, thank you very much. So this will allow us, I think, to engage with some elements of the debate and of argumentation that we haven't really had a chance to touch on. Now, the first thing, as I mentioned, is we need to model out what the potential oil revenues will be and make our decisions preparing for a vast array of scenarios. That is core. But one of the things that will, and this is, if you don't model out the future, you'll find yourself in a lot of, encountering quite a lot of paradoxes, strange situations. As an example, having a higher per capita GDP at purchasing power parity than the UK, basically a higher average income than the United Kingdom, right, if you think of it in simple terms, which is supposed to be a very wealthy country, while at the same time having 43% of poverty. What that means, though, is that we have to, in combination with the fact we have 11 billion barrels of oil, reflect on questions like, should there even be poverty? And in the course of reflecting on those questions, you'll be able to answer a lot of the other development questions. And so one of the reasons that you hear the coalition speaking at length about a people-centered development policy and livable income is not just that we're looking to provide direct cash to people, but rather that alternative mechanism is something that we believe needs to be explored. Now, to be specific, the coalition's policies are not just giveaway cash policies. They're based on research such as the earned income tax credit, such as the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, policies which, and I have citations here, have raised millions of people out of poverty while simultaneously increasing pass rates in high school, simultaneously increasing the labor force participation rate, which the learned gentleman mentioned, and assisting with things like childhood nutrition and so on. They were able to cut malnutrition by 50% according to the World Bank in Brazil through these policies. And so it is not just that we should give away some of our resources for the sake of dealing with the immediate needs of poverty, but to help us to shift the growth pattern of the country. The way that I think we should best think about this is imagine an asteroid out there in space. We used to think that in order to move this asteroid, let's say it's coming towards Earth, you have to destroy it. But now we know if you put a little satellite right next to it early enough, you can pull it off course. And so just by influencing small things within our existing structures, we can actually produce the development we're looking for all along, while simultaneously building out infrastructure and so on and so forth. And so it is not, the idea around cash grant policies and so on is not just about poverty alleviation, but about having tangible impact. That's why that has been highlighted. Now, in terms of sectors that are important, one of the things I know I'm saying one of the things a lot, but anyway.
Elson, could you list 3 sectors that...
Yeah, absolutely. But the key thing here is it's not just sectors. What we have to deal with is this question of total factor productivity. Really is the question of productivity. The Cobb-Douglas function, if any of you are economic students, Cobb and Douglas were professors of economics and of math at Amherst College, which I attended, and they developed a function with a factor that accounts for technology. Now, you could invest in a wide range of sectors. If you don't focus on your level of productivity, as an example, in the agriculture sector, you'll end up like Norway, where in the OECD says that in order for their agriculture to survive, they have to subsidize. So agriculture, but agriculture in a specific way is one.
Please wrap up your response in 30 seconds.
Absolutely. Similarly with manufacturing, once you're thinking about it in this way, you can get it going. And then I think that there's tremendous potential in the tourism industry for Guyana as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Shania Carmichael, and I attend St. Rose's High School. My question for you guys is Guyana on the right path of sustainable development? Money spent on infrastructure being created is not withstanding time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I just want to clarify, you said that it's not withstanding time, it's not standing up over time? Yeah, absolutely. So just to refer to some of my previous comments, the previous framework, if when you spend $1 on a road, you get 59 cents worth of value from that road, you think it's going to stand up? I'll give you another example. If you're buying a Big Six and you pay the man for the Big Six, and the man gives you back 4 instead of 6, is that what you were looking for? Now, we expect a return from our investment in infrastructure. If we start off poorly, then it will impact the return. So when you say sustainable, what happens is that the infrastructure is actually deteriorating. On the flip side, when we talk about the proper planning and management, it is to ensure that we see a benefit from that. Those same principles carry over to the other element, some of the other elements of development, such as in education. And so you may recall me saying that we spent $26 billion. Pass rate at maths, 38%. Spend $60 billion. Pass rate at maths, 34%. That's another perfect example of where there's a question being asked as to whether output and outcomes are the same thing. We need to be looking at outcomes, not just spending money and deeming it development.
Thank you, Mr. Low. Could we have a question from a university student?
Hello, my name is Kimal King. I am a student of economics at the University of Guyana. I'm also a writer for Oil Now, so I am media. I would like to pose one question to each of you, if that's okay. Elson, you have...
No, time wouldn't permit, sorry. One question.
Okay. I'll ask one question and perhaps they can both go at it if they'd like.
Sure. And we'll try to limit the responses to 1 minute because we already passed half of the time allotted for Q&A.
If you ask him and get jealous, you know.
Okay, so my question is with respect to the impact that Guyana's extraordinary development has had on property values.
Yeah.
Property values have spiked a lot in the last few years. I'd like you both to talk about your assessment of how the general public has fared with respect to this issue and how it's consistent with the general argument you have made that on your side, Elson, Guyana is not on the right path, and you, that Guyana is on the right path.
Teach.
I think Well, I can just start off by saying, yes, we've seen a massive expansion in property prices. There's a writer, Thomas Piketty, who highlights that when you see sharp increases in the returns to capital, faster even than the economy, what you see is inequality. And so when you see young people complaining that they can't afford these homes, it's because, according to economic theory, there should have been an acceleration in inequality in the economy. That, to my mind, is not at all what we're looking for. If you have a measure of development, I don't think you're going to want to see more inequality as your measure of development. This is why it is important for any government to be alert to these issues and to deal with them. You may recall that I tried to push for a higher minimum wage last year. It was based on this mathematics.
So it's a consequence of demand and supply. Naturally, if you have a high demand for accommodation, whether it's residential, commercial, or industrial, you're going to have high prices. That's how demand and supply works. And so that is why it's important to push a strong development agenda.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. So my question is one on continuity, because both of you mentioned about the other government. And my question is, what specific things that both of you can agree to disagree or agree on, you all decide, as a country, that we need to focus on so this generation, the current UG students, the two young people who asked the question, can look forward to, outside of the back and forth, that in generations to come, we can live in a country far better than our foreparents and our parents lived in. Thank you.
So I think what is important for that, very important, question for us to ponder on nationally in an apolitical manner, and that is, at a political level, trust. Trust in the sense, in my substantive argument, I referenced the 1996 development strategy. That development strategy was not the product of an intern from the United Nations or the sitting government alone or the opposition. There was inclusivity in terms of the stakeholders that were involved in putting that document together. 200 plus stakeholders, including in this current context, the opposition. So I think where political parties have to build that level of trust, and where they have worked together to put together and chart a path, then they need to commit to that regardless of who is in government. There are few, unfortunately, there is not a lot of this. There's a few examples, very few examples that we could refer to, and one example of recent that I could point to is the Local Content Act. When the government took the local content bill to Parliament, the opposition submitted, I believe, 15 recommendations. I think 10 of them were adopted by the government, and it formed the bill. I think if that kind of approach and level of maturity could be employed in every single bill and policy making and development strategy, low carbon development strategy as well, it went haywire on the part of the opposition. The opposition hasn't submitted any comments on the petroleum bill and so on. If that local content bill could be consistent, then I think that will be good for the country in the future.
Thank you for the question. I would say, I know that there is some contention about the government's ability to perform, but I think that across the aisle, we can agree that we should be trying to perform better. Does that make sense? Maybe we won't be able to reach where we'd like to go immediately, but I think that both sides of the aisle can reasonably agree that efforts should be taken to improve, and that through improvement, we can see better outcomes for the country.
I would agree that there is scope for improvement in performance always. I'm not saying that performance is perfect. I'm not saying that performance is great. Of course, there are many ways in which we can improve. But more importantly is the collective involvement of the political opposition in a serious way to push the country forward.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for the questions coming from the audience. Unfortunately, our time has expired. Allotted for a question.
Moderator, if I may, I'm happy to.
Yeah, we can take one more, Sarge. But I don't know if that works for the university.
Sure.
Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Lloyd Jilks, and I'm a former student of this institution. I want to say to you that I've seen what you young men are doing in the days of Clive Thomas and Walter Rodney. And we had standing room only in this place and on the outside in the corridors. All right? I like the fact that we still have such a tradition. In terms of today's event, I want to say that in my estimation, it's a difficult position to defend, and I admire the young man's gusto and intellect in trying to defend this position. But when you circumscribe your position over the last 30 years, I think you made it difficult for yourself in this way, in that in terms of development, I heard you identify a list of obstruction and difficulties and situations that prevented that development. The thing about it, though, is that most of those were...
Excuse me. Could you?
I'm getting to the question.
Get straight to the question.
Okay, the question is this. You mentioned that one of the problems is the under-education of the population and the non-interest in employment amongst the relatively young population. My question to you is, and I think that was created over the last 30 years, my question to you is, what deliberate action is put in place or is on a short term being created to re-engage the youth and the population in terms of educating, raising the standard? You mentioned correctly that we have the oil economy, but nobody to participate. What is the government doing about it?
Thank you for that question. And if I may say that the question should have been geared towards what was delivered on the debate. He is not the government spokesperson, and I don't think that he can speak on behalf of the government to address that question. Thank you very much for the questions and the responses, and I'll now hand you over to our...
Thank you very much, all. I know you would have wanted a longer time, but we here are on schedule as well, and it really was entertaining to have you here with us this afternoon. We thank you all for being here, for your contributions, and hopefully when we can, or if we can, we'd be delighted to have you again. But it was an enjoyable afternoon. Thank you to our speakers for their contributions, and hopefully we can see what their arguments are about be put to fruition. Thank you all.
Thank you for watching our program. See you right back here, same place, same time. And remember, hold the line of battle, comrades. Our victory is sure.